use as well. I may have gotten those confused. I think I flipped them, Meteor Lake and Lunar Lake. We might
you and the shareholders, Joe. You and the shareholders.
There's too many lakes. There's too many lakes.
We need to cut that out. I apologize, guys.
We need to drain the swamp, boys. If people who are supposed to be subject matter experts can't differentiate or delineate their product stack, that's already a problem.
Yeah.
Right. That's my honest opinion. So if you can't differentiate the difference between 100 VHU, whatever other letter they want to put in there, 200 VHU, same deal. Okay. Clearly they didn't take a note from AMD and add some X's and T's in there too.
Howdy, how's it going? Welcome back, or howdy if you're new. Today we're going to talk about a few topics, but the first topic, we need to talk about Intel. Intel has basically fallen behind in the gaming space, and we're trying to figure out, are they even falling behind in the handheld space? Are they just handing the win to AMD?
I have a hot take, and that is for the handhelds, Intel never had the space. And so, you can take that whichever way you would like. But I think they only really, as far as I know, for mainstream handhelds, have the MSI Claw. All the other Intel CPUs have been only in the original Ionial, which is like an 1165 G7 from like 4 years ago or something like that. So they're not even competing in the handheld space. I think for the desktop space, they've lost a lot of faith in their user base. But that's my opinion, and I would definitely like to know the opinion of our other panelists.
Yeah, Gamers Generation mentioning the MSI Claw, I think, is integral and relevant to the conversation, especially the MSI Claw AI Plus and the performance of the 258V Lunar Lake APU and how that has advanced from the Meteor Lake APU, the Intel Ultra Core 7155H, for example, that we saw on some other devices like the 1X Player 3-in-1 X1 Intel. And even if you place those side by side and look at benchmarks, I mean, compared to the 8840U, it can hold up against that and do really well. But it's still at the same time, I do find that the AMD APUs, they do better. Talk about extending battery life, saving battery life. You're going to get more battery for your mile going with an AMD option, whether it be 2023, 2024, or 2025 AMD mobile APU than what we have seen with Lunar Lake and Meteor Lake as well. But the Meteor Lake can compete. But I will say too that an Intel handheld still feels different from an AMD handheld, and there's still that inherent confidence that someone, I think, would have going with an AMD handheld instead of an Intel handheld.
Yeah, so I used to work for Best Buy, and it seems like that Intel it's kind of been dying a slow death for probably the better part of the last 2 decades, to be honest. So yeah, like I said before, used to work at Best Buy. It was about 2011. I was working over in the home theater side, but getting cross-trained in the kind of consumer, computer space. And these are just like your regular business class, laptops that, you buy for your mom or whatever. And I don't know the exact history, but at least at the time that they were training me, the rhetoric was that AMD was doing the same thing, if not better than Intel, for cheaper. And now it's gotten to the point that it's permeated into every category, gaming, you name it. And to the point that Intel is fallen out of the S&P 500. So this has been a long time coming.
Yeah, they've been losing some market share for sure. I think a lot of people lost faith with them when they had the whole Intel degradation issue with 13th and 14th gen, because before that, everyone knew that they were the best for gaming. They offered the most amount of FPS in all the charts. I think it was really also around the time that when the X3D chips came out, that's when AMD really started edging ahead and dominating. So it's been kind of wild to see that in the desktop space completely flip, and then also people losing their faith in the brand because they don't want to get a CPU that's degrading. And then in the handheld space, when we were looking at the Claw, there's just not always a perfect kind of like one-to-one comparison for every game. So some games might favor Intel, some games might favor AMD. They kind of trade blows back and forth. But the lack of consistency with those, and the lack of consistency with their newer CPUs and GPUs as well, it's been kind of weird. I think a lot of people, when you ask them now what they would prefer if they were going to be going with a graphics card for a desktop, they would want NVIDIA. But if you're asking them about the CPU itself, they're probably going to go AMD immediately. And then when it comes to handhelds, I still think it's just AMD. And I don't know if Intel is going to be able to pick that back up or not. But I guess we'll get to the second question real quick. Do you think that Intel is underestimating the gaming PC market, and should they focus more on it rather than focusing on laptops and desktops? Should they maybe put a little bit more time and investment into the handheld space?
Yeah, I think that there's obviously a big market for it. We can see all the major players like Asus, Lenovo, and now MSI, even though there are rumors that MSI might ditch Intel for AMD, and there are numerous other handheld companies that, our audience is familiar with too. They're all also using AMD chips for the most part of it. There's clearly a market for it. How much of that market makes up the rest of their actual retail sales is anybody's guess. But I think if you could say anything for sure, it's probably that Intel is just not in a good space. Hanstern was talking about the S&P 500, and if you follow the stock market at all, like their stock has not been doing well, and generally that doesn't really have a bearing on consumers per se, but it does have a bearing on how much, let's say, big businesses and stuff and people with a lot of money want to invest in that company. And unfortunately, that also does kind of have this trickle down effect on let's say what works for the direction of the company. And since they had a CEO change, that also probably doesn't sit well with the overall image that the consumers might have, at least those ones that are willing to put their money where their mouth is for Intel spaces. I think for a large part also is that people have a tendency to kind of in the DIY space, and I'm actually going to count handheld gamers somewhat more in the handhelds, I'm going to count handheld gamers more so in that DIY space. We're forgetting that a lot of people will just like buy a PC off the shelf. You know what I mean? Just literally just buy a pre-built PC off of Dell or HP or whatever, stuff like that. And most of those they come with the NVIDIA GPU, and I think there's a tendency now for those to be switching over to AMD CPUs as well. I think maybe like Hanstern, maybe you could help me out on this. Like when you were working at Best Buy, you mentioned I think by default a lot of those pre-built PCs previously used to have Intel chips, right? But that's probably not the case now.
I don't really recall. I think at the time, pre-built PCs weren't really, I think even components really weren't selling there at the time, at least the store I was at. It was a pretty small town anyway. But AMD, was definitely selling more than Intel. I guess to answer the other question as far as whether or not they should focus on consumer, the ugly truth is probably not, if they still want to stay in business. They got shareholders to answer to, and obviously, consumers not where most of the profit is. As much as we would like to have Intel be a player in the space, and as much as, everybody talks well about ARC graphics, the numbers aren't speaking the same way as kind of the just general feeling of things, so to speak.
What I'm wondering too is if, and this is, I don't know the answer to this, I'm just posing this question, is if Intel can make a mobile APU like the 258V, for example, the next APU after the 258V, whatever comes after Lunar Lake, if it can perform well for AAA games at lower TDPs. And I really think the 258V is a step towards that. But if they can optimize even further and go further to do that if that would help with the competition with the 2024, 2025 AMD APU choices in the handheld market. I mean, yes, there are many people that buy these handhelds and they want to go full turbo. They want to put over 60 watts on seeing the total power draw of the handheld itself, and they want to see a high amount of power come from the APU, GPU, and CPU components. But still, there are some that, and I think there's a niche for this, that want to go further with their mile, with their battery, and have that sweet spot of 15 to 20 watts. So I'm wondering if that would help with having the Intel handhelds compete more with the AMD handhelds.
Yeah, I agree. I think power efficiency is something they've kind of fallen off on, especially even if you're looking at just their desktop CPUs. The idle power draw has been, quite bad for a while. So if they're able to get the battery life consistency that people are looking for, and then also I really think that a lot of these brands are focusing too hard on frame generation and upscaling. I know people love that kind of stuff, but I don't think that's going to carry someone forever if they put that more in the focus than the hardware itself. So offering something that has those features is nice, but they really should try to offer the performance that you would be able to get and the battery life that you'd be able to get with something else. Before I would say before I actually had a taste for a handheld with an 80 watt hour or a very large battery, I didn't really care too much about battery life, because I was always just like, oh, the battery life stinks so bad, I'm gonna have to be plugged in anyways, and it kind of defeated the purpose for handheld gaming for me. But with newer devices having larger batteries, I don't think they have to focus on battery life at lower TDPs as much, but they should. I personally don't generally run mine below 20 watts, but there's still a lot of reasons why they need to focus on that, because if you have a smaller, thinner, lighter device, you probably aren't definitely going to be running this thing at those higher TDP levels. So if they could focus on that, and then the other thing I really would like to see them do is offer a good price to performance. That was the last thing I wanted to touch on here. I want to know what you guys think about that, because the price to performance matters so much right now, especially with tariffs and increased costs on everything. Many of these handhelds that have came out with the Intel chips in them, they've been way overpriced. They haven't been reviewed well because the pricing wasn't right, and they just didn't offer that good price to performance. So do you guys think if they do all of these things that we're asking them to, but nail the price to performance, would that be enough? Do you guys think that the prices need to come down with their handhelds if they want to stay competitive?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question too, because I'm thinking of the price of the MSI Claw 8 AI Plus, and it being, I think $899 approximately is where it was.
Not anymore.
Not anymore.
Oh, it's $1,000 now.
It's $1,000. Okay. So so that's even further to the point is you are, for something that much, you should be confident in being able to have the adjustment and variation of how do I want to game? Do I want to go full turbo? Do I want to do low power gaming and have good performance instead of just when in doubt, go to 30 watts and leave it there, like we experience with the Meteor Lake and even with Lunar Lake with some games like Avowed. I would play Avowed with 30 watt TDP on the 258V without a doubt there. So I think it's asking too much at that price. I think the price is too much. If the performance were to be better on future Intel handhelds, then that would justify the price.
So my hot take on that is, because I have nothing but hot takes, especially in the tech space. That would have been accurate, and I would agree with you wholeheartedly, Joe, if this were January 2025. Because of the tariffs that CPPC had mentioned, and just like the wild landscape we're looking at in terms of cost of handhelds and things like that, I actually don't even think they really need to compete. They don't actually need to try that hard. And to be controversial some more, as Handstern said, I think that unfortunately, if we're talking about a resurgence of Intel's coming back up to take their crown, I think all they really need to do is just price themselves slightly lower than AMD. Because one factor that a lot of consumers don't actually think or even care about, I think, is that like AMD and AMD, sorry, let me start over. AMD in NVIDIA and actually like Qualcomm, I guess you would say too, they all produce their chips outside of the country. Intel is the only one that currently anyway produces their chips inside the country. And so they can literally just outprice the competition. The MSI Claw coming in at $1,000 now, which is $100 more than when Joe said he had picked it up at the end of last year, is a spicy price. There's no question about that. But if you look at, for example, the Legion Go S, which we're going to talk about in another video, the Legion Go S, which just recently launched with the Z1 E chip, is $900. And so if you look at those two devices, the Lunar Lake 258V, the MSI Claw, also with the bigger battery, is actually probably long term anyway going to give you the better bang for your buck. So despite the price increase and everything, the prices are increases, you know, like a rising tide raises all ships, right? So like all of the prices are all going up. So in this context, it's like Intel somehow looks like it's the better value at this point. And I think Tech Guy Bo has also said this too. Like if you look at the laptop space, a lot of the laptops that have Lunar Lake chips in them, they are actually pretty efficient. The problem is that you know, laptops being able to have much larger batteries than we have in our handhelds typically. You know, we can't have something like a 1X Fly with the 48 watt hour battery and a Lunar Lake chip in there. Like you're going to get, you know, the old meme of 30 minutes on that thing. Like the problem with the Lunar Lake chips in particular is that they can't, like the desktop CPU like the desktop Intel CPUs, they cannot perform at a lower TDP or lower wattage. They're just not that efficient. But if you give them the power, they can, you know, absolutely, you know, hit hard, right? So, I mean, I think that like if you're in the handheld space particularly, and you're looking at Intel, it might actually be a viable option. And CPC was talking about like the original Claw too, like with the 155H and 135H. Sorry, I think that was you, Joe. That thing came up, yeah, way too pricey. What was that? Like $700 or something like that? Right. But if you look at it now, there are some sales that come up for it, and that thing's like $500. Probably if you looked at the used market and you're willing to play that game, you can get it for like $400. And I think at that price, it's probably, you know, very much competitive, and you can go for something like that and be fairly confident in a pretty decent product too, even though it's not, you know, it's far from perfect at that price, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I just think that, you know, sort of like with the NVIDIA, consumers are not really what they're interested in or what they're chasing, especially if they have to appease shareholders, as Handstern said. You know, they need to get their enterprise businesses off the ground again if they really want to. And the way to do that is to spin up their local fabs and get people to buy more Intel chips just because they're cheaper. You know, because hate to say it, but a lot of businesses, that's all they operate under, right? That's their bottom line. How much is it going to cost them, especially 5-10 years down the road?
Yeah, there's a lot of stock. Like if you go to Micro Center or you talk to any retail level people, there's a lot of excess stock of Intel chips, and there's probably good reason for that with the hesitancy of the degradation. But sometimes you have to take a loss, and I think the longer that they wait, the more of those are going to just sit on the shelves. But I don't know. I'm always a fan of competition, but I just feel like someone needs to give AMD a run for its money, because AMD is just clearly just chilling. They are just vibing. They've got the win on everything right now, and I just wish that Intel would get a little bit more competitive to shake things up for everyone.
If we're talking very specifically handheld space, I totally agree with you. I think, as I mentioned, like the MSI Claw 8, I think is very much, you know, a contender. The problem is you can't get it anywhere. Like even at $1,000, the increased price, it's like it's nowhere to be found.
I wonder if it's because the production numbers are low on it. Because
yeah, that's possible.
If you look on Reddit and you look at other places, you rarely see these people like showing them off. I don't know anyone who has one.
So maybe you know, what is the phrase, like once bitten twice shy? Like maybe they went a little too hard on the first claw, and like they have way too many of those, and they're like, yo, we need to cut back on how many of these make. You know, let's only make one of these for every 5 that we made previously. Like maybe that was the thing, you know. And unfortunately that just ends up hurting us, like the consumers, because I do think, to Joe's point, I think like once we see like 300 series, and hopefully 300 series has like, you know, battle mage based arc graphics, that thing I think can actually topple AMD, you know, like Radeon graphics, at least in the handheld space. But that doesn't matter if you can't buy one, right? Like,
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential with using the MSI technology with AI engine mode with the MSI console M, and using that in alignment with an Intel APU, because it works for some games. It works really well. Black Ops 6, for example, it works well for that, to have a playable experience. So I think it can be improved and evolved. I just think more time, more engineering, advancing it. I think there's a lot there that can happen.
Tell us how you really feel, Joe. Yeah. All right, CPPC. What would you like to pose to us in terms of Intel? I know you are an Intel person, so what would it take for you to buy an Intel handheld and drop an AMD handheld?
Price to performance. I really only care about price to performance if it matters. In my opinion, there's no bad products. There's just bad prices. So something could perform really, really well, and it could be a terrible price, and I would be like, it's not really good value. But if something makes sense price-wise, and it gives you the good amount of FPS per dollar that just makes sense to you, and I don't have a metric for that, but I can look at a device and it just doesn't feel right to me. I also know that with Intel, not all the games are fully optimized across the board like they are with AMD. A lot of the game developers are running AMD when they develop these games. So you get more optimizations there. So the more market share that Intel can gain back across the whole space, even the desktop space, it'll trickle back down into the handheld space, because there's more developers running Intel. They'll develop the games based on those types of CPUs, and it might trickle back down into handheld space too, especially if they can gain some headway with the desktop graphic space as well. I just really think that overall, I know they can make a lot of money in AI, they can make a lot of money in the server industry, but there still is a good bit of people buying desktops, laptops, and handhelds for them to make it profitable. But they've got to make the product good enough at a price point where they can make profit, and it makes sense to us.
Yeah, it reminds me of a point that Tech Guy Bo made to me when I had him on Quick Chat, and we were talking about the future of laptops with the advancement of handhelds and these hybrid 2-in-1 devices, 3-in-1 devices that we were seeing. And I said, what does the future of laptops look like? And he paraphrased that it's a paraphrase. It's finite as long as the APUs that are going into handhelds and in these hybrid devices, if they continue to evolve to meet the performance to that of a laptop. So to turn it to draw relevance back to the point that you were saying, CPPC Tech, it depends on if AMD and if Intel, where do they want to focus on? Do they want to advance the technology with these tablet devices, hybrid devices, handheld devices, and the APUs, the mobile APUs that go in them? Or do they want to continue to evolve that in laptops? And so there are advantages to going with handhelds and these hybrid devices when you're dealing with a single APU instead of both a separate processor that you use for computer processing component as the computer processing component, and then your graphics processing component as well, because the power draw can be less, and then you can take that longer with you on the go.
So what about you, Hans Term? What's your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, so basically, I mean, the way that Intel's going to get out of this is, they're going to be the gas station across the street that's selling their gas for, 2 cents cheaper by the gallon or whatever. Like I mentioned before, when I was working at Best Buy 10, 15 years ago, their AMD was coming up. They were selling basically the same thing, does the same job for, you know, 50 to $100 less for AMD laptop than it was an Intel laptop. Like the meme of AMD GPUs nowadays is Nvidia's price minus, you know, $50 or whatever, but that's worked at least on the CPU side, and that's how I think Intel is gonna. That's the only way they're gonna be able to get any traction going forward.
Yeah, I
right.
agree with that. I fully agree with that point. I mean, AMD for this GPU side, they didn't have the feature stack that NVIDIA had. And so if we're talking about CPUs in particular, Intel has to operate under the similar type of premise, especially if AMD CPUs and APUs have, you know, X3D with the you know, the 3D V cache, and then they have, you know, fluid motion frames, all that kind of stuff. Intel, even though, you know, XeSS has, you know, produced good results, they're going to have to compete on price first and foremost, most likely.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I guess that wraps up all of my questions and the discussion for the Intel topics for today.
Thanks for watching.
Well, yeah.
Well, guys, thanks for tuning in to our little quick chat about Intel, and we hope you tune in for the next one. And if you guys want to catch up with us in the Discord, links in the description as always. And until the next one, I hope you guys have a good afternoon, good evening, or good night.
Take care, all.